All right. I have now started the recording, and now I will ask the judges to introduce themselves. Judges, would you mind introducing yourselves?
Sure. I'm Marcia Holland. I'll be serving as chief judge for today's hearing. I'm in Missoula, Montana. I'm an attorney. Most of my legal practice was as a career public defender in Fairbanks, Alaska. When I moved back to Montana, I started teaching at the law school here. I just finished last week my 9th Zoom mock trial. So I really appreciate that the Center for Civic Education was able to make this virtual competition continue. And we're excited to hear from you.
Good afternoon. My name is Rebecca Steinhoff. I am joining today from Casper, Wyoming. I am the executive director of the John P. Elbogen Foundation. We're a private family foundation that makes grants in Wyoming, including for support for civics initiatives like this one. I am also quite excited to hear from you this afternoon. So thanks for your time and preparation, and we'll look forward to what's ahead.
Hello, everyone. My name is Scott Barnhart. I'm currently located in Indianapolis, Indiana. I'm an attorney as well. I work at the Indiana Attorney General's office. I serve as the Chief Counsel and Director of Consumer Protection, and I am very much interested in hearing what you have to say today. So welcome.
And if you can introduce yourself, and if you have any mentors or teachers or coaches, be sure to give them a shout out as well.
Great. Hi, I'm Ella Eichberg and I'm a junior.
I'm Aiden Hodgen and I'm a junior.
I'm Caroline Kochbar and I'm a junior.
And I'm Graham Cummings and I'm a junior. And our teachers are Matthew Fulford and Mandy Hossetter.
Great. And hopefully is no surprise, we're Unit 6, Question 2, which reads, President Dwight D. Eisenhower said, "We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence by the military industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. Do you agree or disagree? Why? What disagreements did the founders have about a standing army, and are they relevant today? To what extent should there be an international U.S. military presence?" You may begin.
The military-industrial complex is composed of three main institutions that make up the Iron Triangle. The first being the Pentagon and the military itself, the second is the government, and the third is the thousands of private arms and equipment manufacturers that use their leverage and capital to contribute to global conflicts in order to make a profit. As a panel, we agree with President Eisenhower's statement about the danger of the military-industrial complex, and guarding against the unwarranted influence of the complex must be of utmost priority. Companies are spending hundreds of millions of dollars per year influencing defense policy through lobbying and campaign contributions. This fundamentally undercuts the value of our democracy, as defense contractors shape the budget that makes them billions. Having a military company in a state generates revenue in the form of taxes and jobs, incentivizing congresspeople to push for budgets in favor of these companies. For example, in 2014, Ohio Representative Mike Turner authorized $120 million for Abrams tank upgrades, bringing business and jobs to his state. However, the Chief of Staff of the Army repeatedly stated that if we had had our choice, we would have used our money in a different way.
In what is known as the Pentagon revolving door, a 2016 study found that 86% of the top 750 former Pentagon officials and senior military leaders held lucrative jobs as consultants or executives for defense contractors. This potential for corruption is exactly why many of the founding fathers opposed a standing army. In his notes of debates in the Federal Convention, James Madison stated that the means of defense against foreign danger have always been the instruments of tyranny at home. Although Article 1, Section 8, Clauses 11, 13, and 14 all deal with the federal power to raise and support armies, the Army Clause, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 12, provided for a tremendous point of controversy in the Constitutional Convention, as it gives Congress the power to raise and support armies, but no appropriation of money to that use shall be for a longer term than 2 years.
Many anti-federalists feared that the Army Clause gave the federal government the ability to exert their power over state militias and was a dangerous step toward an arbitrary government. Anti-federalist Luther Martin argued that the potentially arbitrary government would threaten individual rights and liberties. In opposition, Federalist Alexander Hamilton argued that a federal standing army would protect citizens, and James Madison argued that a federal standing army and states' individual militias could coexist. Alexander Hamilton also argued that a standing army would be important to respond to the internal issues like the violent uprisings of Shays' Rebellion. The urgent need for the military to respond to the insurrectionists at the Capitol on January 6, 2021, demonstrates one way in which the framers' debates remain relevant. Another founding debate with continued relevance is the role of state militias and the purpose of the Second Amendment.
The U.S. has a massive presence worldwide, with troops in over 150 countries on all habitable continents and military spending greater than that of the next 10 countries combined. The U.S. plays the police of the world. However, this creates an important dilemma. The U.S. is spending too much on the military when we could improve many domestic issues with even a portion of this funding. However, we don't want to be responsible for a preventable genocide, and to guard against civil rights abuses and advance the world, there needs to be a similar influence by NATO countries. The US spends 3.4% of our GDP on the military, while our EU counterparts spend an average of 1.4%, significantly less of their GDP. The best approach to bridge this gap would be to encourage our allies to scale up their militaries while we scale down to some extent, which had started with President Biden's new plan to remove troops from Afghanistan by September 11th. In order to correctly balance the costs and benefits of having a US military presence, we need to work with our allies to have a more similar influence in making the world a better place. We are now open for questions.
Thank you.
Thank you. You noted that there are dollars going into lobbying that's creating influence. Do you think that there should be a limit to the sphere of that lobbying in this particular context?
I would say absolutely. We saw in United States v. Harris that that case created a bunch of loopholes where lobbyists could still contribute to campaigns and influence defense policy. And I think by putting a cap on that limit or even reversing that decision, that we could reduce limits and it would be so that there wouldn't be as much influence coming from outside companies.
Additionally, lobbying regulation doesn't only have to come in the form of capping the amount of money spent on lobbying. It can also just come in the form of strictening the rules, especially after United States v. Harris, and making it so that the rules are applied to a broader range of people.
We can see what my colleague addressed in Elizabeth Warren's proposed legislation in 2019, the Department of Defense Ethics and Anti-Corruption Act, in which she addressed the legislation to limit the influence of contractors on the military. She did that through many ways within this act. Some ways are exposing defense contractors lobbying and making them subject to the federal open records law, and banning the Department of Defense officials from owning contractor stock.
So if we were to contract our military, either physically in terms of the number of people or financially in terms of the amount of resources that we spend, what impact would that have on our status worldwide and our status as a superpower?
Well, I think what we're proposing in our opening isn't necessarily to completely scale back to where we're not a superpower anymore, because that's a very important thing that the United States wants to keep track of. What I think would be more important and would help us retain our superpower status while also helping us reduce the GDP that we spend on military is encouraging our allies to scale up their military so that it's more balanced overall and worldwide.
So let me ask you this. The face of war keeps changing, and it's more likely that it is going to be a cyber attack or some kind of digital attack rather than there's going to be a Scud missile dropped on the United States. So do you think either at the congressional level or within military leadership, someone should do an assessment as to how many rockets and tanks we need versus what we do need to stockpile in order to deal with this next iteration of war?
Absolutely. Cyber threats seem to be a much greater threat to America today. So addressing that over and limiting the amount of tanks we have or whatever it is for the military is essential, because it's very different from World War II to today, where cyber threats were not as big of or a threat at all during World War II as today is very different.
Thanks.
As opposed to traditional artillery, if we get attacked, we can't launch another attack back if our systems are down. So it's really important. Cybersecurity should be a priority in how we how we address conflict in today's world. And also, I think Congress should change how they allocate the defense budget to emphasize the military's needs and not that of individual congressmen. So this may mean working closely with military officials when allocating money to different departments.
And one way that we can do this is through the proposed Safe Tech app that was proposed by Senators Warner and Klobuchar to revise Section 230 of the 1934 Commissions Act, which would help deter cybercrime and provide incentives for tech companies to monitor posts, leading to more secure sites and less potential for terrorism.
I would agree with my colleague, but I would also argue that we need to, as well as applying it to social media companies, it needs to be applied broader to all of America's infrastructure, because one successful attack could take down hospital systems or important infrastructure around the country.
Thank you.
Kind of a different question. If we talk about reducing the size of the military and its presence, do we need to simultaneously increase the United States capacity for diplomacy? Or is there a trade-off, or what's the relationship between the military's presence and diplomacy?
Well, I think that relationship is a really strong one, and we can see this demonstrated in what happened in Iran and Israel last week, where they were trying to negotiate a new nuclear deal, and then Israel went and bombed one of their nuclear facilities. And this diplomacy that was happening between the United States and Iran was somewhat disrupted because of this attack that happened. And I think we can apply that to a worldwide stage and see that, like, without force on the table, that these effects and these attempts at diplomacy are going to go unnoticed.
I think it's super important that pulling out with conventional forces out of an area doesn't necessarily mean that we're cutting ties with that country. For example, the most recent plan to pull out of Afghanistan, that was followed with the Afghanistan Security Forces Fund, which just means that we're going to be continuing to provide training and assistance towards the Afghan military so that they can keep on developing and keep their protection.
Additionally, a lot of these trade-offs wouldn't necessarily have to happen if we're working very closely with our allies. So if we pull out and have our allies scale up a little bit, then we can kind of balance it out and not experience some of these trade-offs.
I'm interested in hearing what role the state militias should play moving forward, if any.
Well, I think the role of the state militias has changed dramatically since our founding. I think one of the issues that we addressed was the issue of a standing army and the controversies that surrounded over that. And I think the meaning, and following that, the meaning of the Second Amendment and how the Second Amendment applies to those militias moving forward has changed, because it says state militias, not these subsequent groups that might have been present during the January 6th insurrection.
So let me ask this. Do you think the United States should rethink how they talk to other countries? In other words, if it's a country that does not treat their citizens well, should there be a greater military presence or keep a base there? Whereas if it's a country perhaps like Germany, where diplomatic relations are appear to be pretty solid, we should pull out. How should that decision be made?
Well, I would take the stance of what an international relations scholar would call idealist foreign policy, which is that the US has a role in guiding other countries towards democracy and helping to prevent civil rights abuses. And that should be our focus in military engagement. But I also think that diplomacy is a really important step in this. And trying to negotiate with other countries should be of utmost priority.
I would disagree with my colleague and take more of what a foreign policy advisor would say realist position, and say that we should only get involved in international military conflicts when there are economic and security threats to the United States, and kind of see and evaluate the military conflicts abroad and how they would affect the United States. And if it would be a negative impact, then we should get involved.
Thank you.
Time.
So take a deep breath. We'll provide a few comments, and then we'll be moving back into the break room. So I appreciate your explanation in your prepared remarks, especially phrases that really convey information just by word choice. That contractors shape budgets, I think, is a really effective way to make the point that you were making. And the Pentagon revolving door, you took the time to actually explain that instead of just using it as a term of art, which you might expect to hear in these congressional hearings. You took the time to explain it. A really important point, which you brought up, was the 2-year funding cycle, which hasn't really been followed very much, but at least constitutionally, people were worried about that. You used great use of stats. You used great contemporary examples, such as Elizabeth Warren's proposal, Senator Klobuchar and Warren's proposal. You're reading the newspaper from last week, which gives me incredible confidence that you will be our next national, state, and local leaders. And so I just close with final. It's almost as if you anticipated our questions because you had such a depth of knowledge that you could convey your information, especially even the last one, where agree to disagree presented 2 very valuable points of view, pragmatism versus idealism. I really appreciate that. So thank you.
I would echo a lot of what Marcia has said. I think too, you had a balanced approach to thinking about some of these. And so you had a stance, but also gave some consideration to the other side. And so we like to see that a little bit. I think you had some strong language around, revolving doors and just thinking about costs and benefits. And so some really clear descriptions that I think help us get a sense of where you're going and help to quantify what's ahead. And as was stated, you had some really rich examples, both contemporary and historical, that I think just add a lot to your stance and to the direction of your argument. And so it's really helpful for us to know that you've been thoughtful about that over time. And in this particular issue, there are a lot of dynamics. And so to be able to pull relevance from different examples like that is really powerful. And you did a really wonderful job with that. Thank you.
Yeah, I agree. You all did a great job. I think that one of the things you didn't do is you didn't over answer the question. I think teams have a tendency of over answering the questions, and the reason why it's beneficial is if you don't over answer the questions, and you get to more questions, right? So you get to demonstrate in terms of how much knowledge you have and your examples and all that. I thought you had really good examples. The ability to use things that are current, happening today or last week, is a demonstration to us as judges that you really understand the material, because it's not something you study in a textbook. It's something you saw and can convert it to what we're discussing. So I was really impressed by that. I really enjoyed this discussion. So well done. Good job.
And if I can add one small additional comment, the idea that a cyber attack that shuts systems down, which means we can't even respond with military might, such a practical thought. Just really amazed that someone thought of that. Good job.
Thank you.
Thank you.